Welcome to True Crime Trolls. In this episode, we're diving into one of the most chilling and mysterious cases in criminal history. This elusive figure terrorized Northern California in the late 1960s, leaving behind a trail of cryptic messages and unsolved murders that continue to baffle investigators to this day. Join us as we explore the dark story of the Zodiac, the victims, and the hunt for a killer who remains unidentified. In the late 1960s, Northern California was gripped by fear. A shadowy figure, known only as the Zodiac Killer, embarked on a reign of terror that would leave an indelible mark on the annals of true crime history. This is the story of his victims, the relentless investigation, and the enduring mystery that haunts us to this day. Riverside, California, October 30th, 1966. It was a typical autumn evening, the kind where students at Riverside City College busied themselves with last-minute studies before Halloween festivities. Cherry Jo Bates, an 18-year-old student, was among them, spending her evening at the campus library. But as the clock ticked past 9 p.m., an air of unease began to settle over the campus, an unseen menace lurking in the shadows. Cherry Jo, unaware of the danger closing in around her, left the library after it closed at 9 p.m. She walked toward her car, parked in a dimly lit lot near the library. But tonight, something was different. Unbeknownst to Cherry Jo, her car had been tampered with. Someone had been watching her. In the darkness, a figure lurked, his eyes never leaving her. This was no random attack. He had been waiting for her, studying her movements, planning every detail. As Cherry Jo approached her car, she discovered that it wouldn't start. Frustrated, she glanced around for help, her eyes catching the shadowy figure as he stepped out of the darkness. The man approached, offering assistance with a voice that was unnervingly calm. His demeanor was so disarming that Cherry Jo didn't suspect a thing. After all, who would expect that this polite stranger was a predator, a wolf in sheep's clothing? As he pretended to inspect the car, Cherry Jo's unease grew. There was something unsettling about the way he moved, the way his eyes darted around the parking lot, checking to see if they were alone. And they were. Without warning, the man lunged at Cherry Jo, grabbing her from behind. She fought back with all her strength, but the attacker was relentless. In the struggle, her screams were muffled by his hand, her desperate cries for help, swallowed by the cold night air. He pulled out a knife, the blade catching the pale light of the moon for just a moment before plunging it into her. Over and over, each thrust more frenzied than the last, as if he was possessed by a dark, uncontrollable rage. Cherry Jo, her strength fading, stumbled away, her blood staining the pavement. But the killer wasn't finished. He dragged her into a nearby alley, hidden from view, where he continued his brutal assault. In her final moments, Cherry Jo's hand reached out, her fingers twitching in a last, desperate plea for life before falling still. The killer stood over her, breathing heavily, the reality of his actions sinking in. But instead of fleeing in panic, he methodically wiped the blood from his hands, as if he had just completed a task, a ritual. It wasn't until the next morning that Cherry Jo Bates's body was discovered, lying lifeless in the alley. Her face was almost unrecognizable from the savage beating she had endured. The sight sent shockwaves through the campus and the community. The scene was one of unimaginable horror. Blood splattered across the pavement, her car abandoned with its hood still open, a grim reminder of the nightmare that had unfolded there. Whoever had done this was not only a killer, but a monster, lurking in the shadows of Riverside. On November 29, 1966, nearly a month after the brutal murder of Cherry Jo Bates, a mysterious letter arrived at the Riverside Police Department. The letter, typed on plain white paper, offered a chilling insight into the mind of the killer and an ominous warning. The letter began with a bold title, The Confession, and what followed was a detailed, cold, and methodical account of the events leading up to and including the murder of Cherry Jo Bates. I am not sick. I am insane. But that will not stop the game. This letter should be published. It just might save that girl in the alley. The letter described how the killer had disabled Cherry Jo's car by pulling out the distributor coil wire, ensuring that she would be stranded and vulnerable. The writer then detailed how they had approached her under the guise of offering help, before leading her to a secluded alley. The letter was brutally explicit, describing the attack with chilling detachment. The writer claimed that Cherry Joe had fought back, but was overpowered, her screams silenced by the knife that ended her life. She was young and beautiful, but now she is battered and dead. I am not sick. I am insane. But that will not stop the game. But it was the final lines of the letter that truly sent chills down the spines of those who read it. The writer ended with a haunting warning, a promise that they were not done. Beware, I am stalking your girls now. Every night they will look over their shoulders, wondering if I am that person behind them. I will strike again, but it will not be any of your children unless you do something to stop me. The police shall never catch me because I have been too clever for them. The message was clear. The killer had no intention of stopping. They would strike again, and they wanted the police, the public, and every potential victim to know that. The letter was immediately taken seriously by investigators. They compared it to other writings and conducted a thorough analysis, but the identity of the writer remained elusive. The details in the letter were too accurate to be dismissed as a hoax. This was almost certainly from the hand of Cherry Joe Bates's killer. R. Despite the efforts of the Riverside police, the letter provided no clear leads. It only deepened the mystery, heightening the fear that the killer was still out there, watching, waiting to strike again. On the bone-chilling night of December 20th, 1968, the quaint town of Vallejo, California, lay shrouded in an unsettling stillness. For Betty Lou Jensen, 16, and David Faraday, 17, the evening promised romance and adventure. Betty Lou, with her cascading brown hair and infectious laughter, was the heartthrob of Hogan High School. David, tall and athletic, harbored dreams of a bright future, his shy demeanor masking a heart of gold. Excited for their first official date, David meticulously polished his family's Rambler station wagon. He picked up Betty Lou, who looked radiant in her favorite blue dress, and together they attended a Christmas concert at their high school. The music filled them with joy, the holiday spirit wrapping around them like a warm embrace. After the concert, David suggested they take a scenic drive to Lake Herman Road, a secluded lover's lane known for its panoramic views and privacy. Betty Lou agreed, her heart fluttering with anticipation. As they navigated the winding road, the car's headlights slicing through the inky darkness, they felt a sense of freedom and exhilaration. When they reached the gravel turnout, David parked the car, and they settled in, talking about their dreams and future plans. Unbeknownst to them, a pair of eyes watched from the shadows, filled with malevolent intent. The killer had been following them, his breath fogging in the cold night air as he observed their every move. The couple's laughter echoed softly in the still night, unaware of the looming danger. The killer, hidden among the trees, moved closer, his footsteps silent on the damp ground. He watched as David leaned in to kiss Betty Lou, the moment tender and pure. But the tranquility was shattered when the car's interior light flickered, casting eerie shadows and alerting the couple to a presence outside. David turned, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Did you hear something?" he whispered, his voice tinged with unease. Betty Lou, her heart racing, clutched his arm. "Maybe it's just the wind," she replied, trying to mask her growing fear. Suddenly the killer stepped into the dim light, a sinister figure emerging from the night. He approached the car with deliberate steps, his breath steady and controlled. David and Betty Lou's hearts pounded in unison, their bodies paralyzed with fear. The killer rapped on the window with the barrel of his gun, the sound sharp and metallic. "Get out," he commanded, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. Trembling, David opened the door and stepped out, his hands raised in a futile attempt to protect Betty Lou. Without hesitation, the killer raised his gun and fired. The loud gunshot echoed through the night, and David collapsed, a crimson pool spreading beneath him. Betty Lou, her eyes wide with terror, flung open her door and ran, her footsteps echoing in the silence. She could hear the killer's measured breathing behind her, the crunch of gravel under his feet. Desperation fueled her flight, but the killer was relentless. He raised his gun and fired 5 shots, each one a cruel punctuation to her frantic cries. Betty Lou fell to the ground, her life extinguished, the stars above her indifferent to her fate. He wiped the blood from his hands. He took a deep breath, relishing the lingering scent of gunpowder and fear that clung to the air. The lifeless bodies of Betty Lou Jensen and David Faraday lay behind him, their blood staining the ground beneath the cold moonlight. With meticulous care, he retraced his steps, ensuring no trace of his presence was left behind. Stealthily, he made his way back to his car, parked a short distance away in a secluded grove of trees. The old dark sedan blended perfectly into the night, a ghostly chariot ready to whisk him away. He opened the trunk and stashed his tools of terror, a gun, gloves, and a flashlight, inside a weathered duffel bag. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at his reflection in the rearview mirror, a ghostly visage staring back. He felt a twisted satisfaction curling in his chest, a dark thrill coursing through his veins. He drove with deliberate slowness, the car's engine purring quietly as he navigated the empty roads. The town of Vallejo slept soundly, unaware of the monster that prowled its outskirts. He took a winding route through the back streets, avoiding main roads and any potential witnesses. The radio played soft static, an eerie soundtrack to his nocturnal journey. Eventually, he reached the edge of town, where the lights of civilization gave way to the oppressive darkness of the rural countryside. He pulled over by a lonely stretch of road where the silence was thick and unbroken. Here, he felt a perverse sense of freedom, a connection to the vast, indifferent universe. In the dark recesses of his mind, he began to craft his next move. He knew that fear was a powerful weapon, one he wielded with precision. The thought of sending a letter to the local newspapers filled him with a giddy anticipation. He imagined the panic that would ripple through the community, the helplessness and dread that would settle like a pall over the town. It was a game, and he was the puppet master. He retrieved a notebook and pen from the glove compartment and began to write, his handwriting a series of deliberate, angular strokes. He carefully described the details of the murders, including information only the killer would know. He signed the letter with a chilling symbol, a crosshair, and the name he had chosen for himself, Zodiac. As he finished, he felt a strange sense of satisfaction. The letter was a declaration, a promise of more to come. He sealed it in an envelope, addressed it to the Vallejo Times-Herald, and tucked it away. Tomorrow, he would mail it, and the game would continue. Before driving off, he took one last look at the night sky. The stars seemed to twinkle with a malevolent light, as if they too were in on his secret. He smiled to himself, a twisted grin that reflected his dark soul. He knew that his reign of terror was just beginning, and the world had yet to realize the extent of his madness. With a final glance at the moonlit road, he started the engine and drove into the night, a phantom in the darkness, leaving behind only death and the promise of fear. July 4th, 1969, Vallejo, California. The night sky over Vallejo, California, was ablaze with fireworks, a celebration of Independence Day that masked the sinister events unfolding in the shadows. Darlene Farron, 22, a vibrant and vivacious young woman with a magnetic personality, was out with her friend, Michael Magot. The summer air was thick with the scent of barbecue and the distant crackle of fireworks, but beneath the festive atmosphere, a chilling presence lurked. Darlene had always been the life of the party, her infectious energy drawing people to her wherever she went. That evening, she had decided to drive out to Blue Rock Springs Park, a quiet spot just outside of town. It was a place she often visited to escape the noise and bustle of the city, where she could relax and talk freely. Michael, a close friend, joined her, unaware of the terror that would soon engulf them. As Darlene's car rolled to a stop in the isolated parking lot, the sounds of fireworks faded into the background, replaced by an unnerving silence. The park, usually serene, felt ominous under the cloak of night. The only light came from the distant glow of the city, casting long, distorted shadows across the deserted lot. Unbeknownst to them, they were not alone. A car had followed them from a distance, its headlights off, moving like a predator stalking its prey. The Zodiac killer, his heart pounding with anticipation, watched as Darlene and Michael chatted, oblivious to his presence. He had chosen them carefully, his dark mind relishing the thought of the fear he would soon inflict. As Darlene and Michael sat in the car, talking quietly, the ominous figure behind the wheel of the other car slowly approached. The Zodiac's car came to a halt just behind them, its engine idling like a beast waiting to strike. Michael noticed the car first, his voice tense as he mentioned it to Darlene. She turned to look, her heart skipping a beat as the car's lights flickered on, momentarily blinding them. Darlene's pulse quickened as the figure stepped out of the car, his movements deliberate and methodical. He approached their vehicle, his face obscured by the shadows. The hairs on the back of Darlene's neck stood on end, a primal instinct warning her that something was terribly wrong. Without a word, the Zodiac killer shone a bright flashlight into their car, blinding them momentarily. The sudden light was disorienting, and in that brief moment of confusion, he drew his gun, his hand steady, as he aimed it at Darlene. Time seemed to slow as he pulled the trigger, the gunshot exploding in the still night air, drowning out the distant fireworks. The bullet tore through the car's window, striking Darlene in the chest. She gasped, the pain searing through her body as she clutched her wound, blood soaking through her dress. The killer fired again, the second shot hitting Michael, who screamed in agony, his body contorting with the force of the impact. Darlene, gasping for breath, tried to reach out to Michael, her vision blurring as she fought to stay conscious. But the killer wasn't finished. He moved closer, his silhouette looming over the car like a dark omen. He fired several more shots into the car, each one a death sentence. Darlene's body jerked with each impact, her strength fading as the life drained from her. The Zodiac killer stood there for a moment, watching the life ebb from Darlene's eyes, savoring the fear and chaos he had created. He felt a twisted satisfaction, a perverse pleasure in the control he held over their lives. Satisfied with his work, he turned and walked back to his car, his footsteps echoing in the empty lot. He drove away calmly, the sound of fireworks once again filling the night air as if nothing had happened. The park, now eerily silent, was left with the gruesome aftermath of his visit. The blood-soaked car, the shattered glass, and the two broken bodies inside were the only evidence of the horror that had transpired. Minutes later, a couple driving through the park stumbled upon the horrific scene. Their screams pierced the night as they discovered the bodies of Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, the former lifeless, the latter clinging to the last threads of life. Emergency services were called, but for Darlene, it was too late. The echo of the gunshots still rang in his ears as the Zodiac killer drove away from Blue Rock Springs Park, his blood pulsing with an adrenaline-fueled thrill. The car hummed beneath him, the engine purring like a satisfied predator after a successful hunt. In the rearview mirror, the park's shadowy silhouette grew smaller, receding into the darkness like a fading memory. He felt no guilt, no remorse, only the lingering euphoria that came from exerting absolute control over life and death. As the town of Vallejo sparkled with the last remnants of Independence Day fireworks, he blended into the night, just another car on the road. To anyone who might have seen him, he was unremarkable, a phantom behind the wheel of a nondescript vehicle. He navigated the winding roads with a calculated calm, his thoughts already turning to his next move. The police would soon descend on the scene, sirens blaring, their futile attempts to piece together what had happened adding to the chaos. He imagined the look of horror on the faces of those who would discover the blood-soaked car, the broken bodies of Darlene Ferrin and Michael Mageau, one dead, the other clinging to life. The thought brought a twisted smile to his lips. Reaching the outskirts of town, he pulled off the main road onto a narrow dirt path that cut through the dense woods. The trees closed in around him, their twisted branches forming a canopy overhead, blotting out the sky. Here, in the suffocating darkness, he felt at home. The car came to a stop in a secluded clearing, far from prying eyes. He killed the engine and sat in silence, listening to the quiet of the forest, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of a nocturnal animal. For a moment, he closed his eyes, letting the night envelop him, the cool air filling his lungs. Reaching over to the passenger seat, he retrieved a small black notebook and a pen. By the dim light of the car's interior, he began to write. The words flowed easily, a mix of taunts and cold, calculated confessions. He detailed the events of the night with clinical precision, reliving each moment of terror he had inflicted. His handwriting was methodical, almost neat, each letter crafted with care. As he wrote, he crafted his next message to the world, a letter that would soon arrive at the Vallejo Times-Herald, a declaration of his superiority, and a reminder that he was always watching. He signed it with his chosen symbol, a crosshair, and the name he had given himself, Zodiac. Satisfied with his work, he tore the page from the notebook and carefully folded it, slipping it into an envelope he had prepared earlier. He addressed it with slow, deliberate strokes, imagining the panic that would spread once his letter was received. The thought of the fear he would ignite brought a surge of satisfaction, a reminder of the power he wielded. But he wasn't done yet. There was more to be done to ensure the legend of the Zodiac would grow, to make sure his name would never be forgotten. He took out a pair of surgical gloves and slipped them on, his movements precise and practiced. From the trunk, he retrieved a small black duffel bag containing a change of clothes. The blood-stained garments he had worn during the attack were stripped off and stuffed into the bag. He donned the clean clothes with the same meticulous care, leaving no room for mistakes. Once dressed, he placed the bag of evidence in the trunk, next to a gasoline canister. He took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of gasoline as he doused the bag. The flames would consume the evidence, leaving nothing but ash behind. He lit a match and tossed it in, watching as the fire roared to life, the flames licking the night sky. As the fire crackled, the Zodiac turned his attention to the envelope, now ready for its journey. He would mail it the next day, confident that it would reach its destination and sow the seeds of fear he so craved. The world would know that the Zodiac was out there, always watching, always waiting for the next moment to strike. When the fire had reduced everything to ash, he extinguished it and buried the remains, leaving no trace of what had occurred. He took one last look at the clearing, his expression unreadable, before getting back into his car. The night was still young, and the road ahead was long. As he drove away, the distant lights of Vallejo flickered on the horizon, oblivious to the darkness that had just brushed against them. The Zodiac killer disappeared into the night, his thoughts already drifting to the future, to the next time he would emerge from the shadows to claim more lives, leaving behind only terror and mystery in his wake. On the morning of July 31st, 1969, the newsrooms of three major Bay Area newspapers, the San Francisco Examiner, San Francisco Chronicle, and Vallejo Times-Herald, were about to receive a chilling message. Three identical letters, postmarked from San Francisco, were delivered to each office. Inside each envelope was a cryptic cipher, along with a disturbing claim from someone who called themselves the Vallejo Killer. The letters began with a stark declaration. I am the killer of the two teenagers last Christmas at Lake Herman, and the girl last 4th of July. The writer claimed responsibility for the recent murders that had terrorized the Vallejo area, but it was the enclosed ciphers that truly captured their attention. Each letter contained a 1/3 portion of a cryptic cipher, a puzzle of strange symbols and letters that the writer insisted held the key to their identity. The instructions were clear and unsettling. Each newspaper was to publish its portion of the cipher on the front page of the next day's edition. Here is a cipher, or that is part of one. The other two parts of this cipher are being sent to the SF Examiner and SF Chronicle. I want you to print this cipher on your front page by Friday afternoon, August 1st, 1969. If you do not do this, I will go on a kill rampage that will last the whole weekend. I will cruise around and pick off all stray people or couples that are alone, then move on to kill some more until I have killed over a dozen people. The threat was explicit. Publish the ciphers or face a potential killing spree. The newspapers were thrust into a moral quandary. Should they comply with the demands of a self-proclaimed killer, potentially putting lives at risk? Or should they refuse, possibly provoking further violence? In the end, all three newspapers decided to publish the ciphers. The potential consequences of not doing so were too grave to ignore. But even as the ciphers were being prepared for publication, a deeper fear set in. What if the killer was watching, waiting to see how they would respond? On August 1st, 1969, the ciphers were published, just as the killer had demanded. The public reaction was immediate. Across the Bay Area, readers were both fascinated and horrified by the strange symbols and the dark message they carried. For some, it was a thrilling puzzle to solve. For others, it was a chilling reminder that a murderer was out there, taunting them from the shadows. The ciphers sparked a wave of interest among amateur codebreakers and professional cryptographers alike. Some saw it as a challenge, a way to help catch the killer. But the deeper meaning of the ciphers remained elusive, adding to the growing sense of dread. As the weekend approached, fear spread across the region. Would the killer make good on their threat if the ciphers were not solved? Would there be another wave of violence? The uncertainty hung in the air, a palpable tension that gripped the community. The ciphers remained unsolved for days, leaving the public in suspense. But for the killer, this was just the beginning, a game of cat and mouse that would haunt the Bay Area for years to come. And as the night fell on August 1st, many in Vallejo and San Francisco lay awake, wondering if they would be next. On August 2nd, 1969, just one day after the Bay Area newspapers published the cryptic ciphers, a new letter arrived at the San Francisco Chronicle. This is the Zodiac speaking. In answer to your asking for more details about the good times I have had in Vallejo, I shall be very happy to supply even more material. In the letter, the self-proclaimed Zodiac killer recounted the murders with eerie precision, as if reliving them brought him a twisted sense of satisfaction. He described the murders at Lake Herman Road on December 20th, 1968, and Blue Rock Springs on July 4th, 1969, providing details only the true killer would know. He provided specifics about the crimes that had never been released to the public, details of the weapons he used, the number of shots fired, and the positions of the bodies. These were details that only the killer could have known, leaving no doubt in the minds of the police that they were dealing with a man who had indeed committed these heinous acts. I was the man who shot the kids in the parked car. I'm also the same man who killed those people last year. To prove this, I shall state some facts, which only I plus the police know. The Zodiac didn't just want to prove he was the killer. He wanted to taunt the police, to show them that he was in control. He listed facts about the murders that had never been made public, daring the police to catch him. His tone was arrogant, even gleeful, as he recounted the good times he had in Vallejo. But it wasn't just the murders that the Zodiac took pleasure in. It was the game he was playing, the psychological torment he was inflicting on the police and the public. He ended the letter with a chilling promise. There would be more victims. September 27th, 1969, Lake Berryessa, Napa County. The late afternoon sun bathed the rolling hills of Lake Berryessa in a golden glow as Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard, both 20, found a secluded spot by the shore. The serene setting seemed perfect for a peaceful day by the water. Brian, a law student with a laid-back demeanor, had invited Cecilia, a kind-hearted, thoughtful young woman, for a relaxing picnic. The lake, with its calm waters and picturesque surroundings, provided an idyllic escape from their busy lives. As they spread out a blanket on the grassy knoll overlooking the lake, the soft murmur of water lapping against the shore added to the tranquility. They laughed and talked, sharing stories and enjoying each other's company as the afternoon stretched lazily into early evening. But as the sun began its descent, casting long shadows across the landscape, an unsettling sense of isolation crept over them. Unbeknownst to Brian and Cecilia, they were not alone. Hidden among the trees that bordered the shore, a dark figure watched them with cold, calculating eyes. The Zodiac killer had arrived at Lake Berryessa earlier, drawn by the solitude and the perfect opportunity it presented. Dressed in a black hooded executioner's outfit, he was armed with a long knife and a gun, ready to unleash his carefully crafted terror. From his vantage point in the trees, the Zodiac observed the couple for hours, waiting patiently as they laughed and relaxed, oblivious to the malevolent presence closing in on them. His heart raced with anticipation, his breath steady as he planned his next move. The tranquility of the lake was a stark contrast to the violence he was about to unleash, and that contrast thrilled him. As the sun dipped lower, casting the lake in a deep amber hue, the Zodiac decided it was time. He moved silently through the underbrush, his footsteps muffled by the soft earth. His dark figure blended seamlessly with the lengthening shadows, making him nearly invisible as he approached the couple from behind. Cecilia was the first to notice something was wrong. A chill ran down her spine, and she turned her head slightly, her eyes narrowing as she caught sight of movement in the corner of her vision. At first, she thought it might be an animal, but then she saw the figure, a man, dressed in a bizarre black hood, emerging from the trees. Her heart began to pound in her chest, a primal fear gripping her. "Brian?" she whispered, her voice trembling as she tugged on his sleeve. Brian turned, following her gaze, and his blood ran cold. The man was approaching them slowly, deliberately, his face obscured by the hood, a strange symbol, a white crosshair emblazoned on his chest. Before Brian could react, the Zodiac killer was upon them, a gun in his gloved hand. "Don't move!" The killer's voice was cold, almost mechanical, as he pointed the weapon at Brian. "Do exactly as I say, and you won't get hurt." Brian and Cecilia froze, their minds racing with fear and confusion. The Zodiac, calm and in control, ordered Brian to lie face down on the blanket. Trembling, Brian obeyed, his thoughts consumed with protecting Cecilia. The killer handed Cecilia a length of pre-cut rope, his voice steady as he instructed her to tie Brian's hands behind his back. Her hands shook as she wrapped the rope around Brian's wrists, her heart breaking as she did what she was told. The Zodiac watched, his dark eyes emotionless behind the mask. Once Brian was secured, he took another length of rope and tied Cecilia's hands as well, binding them together with cruel precision. The couple lay helpless on the blanket, the peaceful picnic now a horrifying scene of captivity. But the worst was yet to come. The Zodiac slowly unsheathed a long, gleaming knife, its blade catching the fading sunlight. He knelt beside Brian, his voice low and devoid of any emotion. "I'm going to kill you," he said, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. In a sudden, brutal motion, the Zodiac plunged the knife into Brian's back, the blade sinking deep into his flesh. Brian gasped in pain, his body convulsing as the killer stabbed him again and again, the relentless assault fueled by a cold, methodical cruelty. Blood soaked the blanket, pooling beneath Brian as he struggled to breathe, the world around him fading into a blur of agony. Cecilia screamed, her voice echoing across the lake as she watched in horror. The Zodiac turned his attention to her, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. He raised the knife, its blade glistening with Brian's blood, and brought it down on Cecilia with the same terrifying precision. She felt the cold steel pierce her skin, the pain sharp and all-consuming. Over and over, the knife found its mark, each strike a merciless reminder of the killer's power over life and death. When the Zodiac finally stopped, he stood over the mutilated bodies of Brian and Cecilia, his breathing heavy but controlled. He took a moment to admire his work, the gruesome scene he had created, before turning away. He calmly walked back to his car, parked a short distance away, leaving the couple to die alone on the shore of the now eerily silent lake. Before leaving, the Zodiac took out a black marker and wrote a message on Brian's car door, detailing the date, time, and method of the attack, along with his signature symbol, the crosshair. It was a taunt, a declaration of his presence, meant to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who read it. As he drove away, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging Lake Berryessa into darkness. The night was quiet, save for the faint, labored breathing of Brian and Cecilia as they clung to life. Hours later, a fisherman would discover the horrific scene, but by then, the Zodiac killer would be long gone, vanished into the night, leaving behind only death and the promise of more to come. The night had descended over Lake Berryessa, wrapping the countryside in a suffocating darkness as the Zodiac killer drove away from the scene of his latest atrocity. The knife he had used to stab Brian Hartnell and Cecilia Shepard was safely stowed in the trunk of his car, wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. The thrill of the kill still buzzed in his veins, a heady mix of power and satisfaction. He had left them there, broken and bleeding, on the shore of the peaceful lake, a brutal contrast to the calm waters that had reflected the last light of day. The road ahead was winding and empty, the headlights of his car slicing through the inky blackness. The Zodiac's hands were steady on the wheel, his mind already calculating his next move. This had been a successful hunt, but he knew it was only part of a larger game. The fear he sowed was as important as the act itself. Every detail had to be perfect, from the way he approached his victims to the message he would soon send. After driving for nearly an hour, the Zodiac pulled off onto a narrow, unmarked dirt road that led deep into the woods. The trees pressed in on both sides, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. He had scouted this location weeks before, knowing he would need a place to lay low, to clean up, and to plan his next steps. The cabin he had found, abandoned and forgotten, was the perfect hideaway. The cabin sat in a small clearing, its wooden walls weathered and worn by time. He parked the car and stepped out, the night air cool against his skin. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant call of an owl, adding to the eerie stillness. As he entered the cabin, he flicked on a small battery-powered lantern, its dim light casting long shadows across the room. Inside, the Zodiac moved with purpose. He retrieved a basin from a corner and filled it with water from a rain barrel outside. He then unwrapped the knife, the cloth now heavy with congealed blood, and began to meticulously clean the blade. The water turned a deep dark red as he wiped away the evidence of his crime, leaving the steel gleaming under the lantern's light. Once satisfied, he dried the knife and placed it back in its sheath, stowing it in a hidden compartment beneath the cabin's floorboards. Next, he stripped off his blood-stained clothing, bundling it tightly before tossing it into a large metal drum outside. He doused the clothes in gasoline, struck a match, and watched as the flames leapt up, consuming the fabric in a flash. The fire crackled and popped, the acrid smell of burning cloth mingling with the night air. He stood there for a moment, staring into the flames, his mind already detached from the acts he had committed earlier that evening. Once the fire had burned out, leaving nothing but ashes, the Zodiac returned to the cabin and dressed in a fresh set of clothes. He knew the next part of his plan was crucial: communicating with the press, taunting the authorities, feeding the fear that had already begun to take root in the public's imagination. He sat at a small, rickety table, pulled out his notebook, and began to write. His hand moved steadily across the paper, the words flowing with ease. He described the murder with chilling detail, the calm precision of his language, a stark contrast to the horror of the events. He included the exact time and place, the number of times he had stabbed his victims, and the symbol that had become his signature, the crosshair. He imagined the reactions of the police, the reporters, the people who would read his letter. Imagined the fear spreading like wildfire through the community. When he finished writing, he folded the letter carefully and sealed it in an envelope. He addressed it to the local newspaper, knowing it would cause a stir the moment it was opened. The letter was not just a confession, it was a statement of his superiority, a way to remind everyone that he was out there, always watching, always ready to strike again. The Zodiac allowed himself a brief smile as he placed the letter in his jacket pocket. The night was still young, and there was work to be done. He would drive into town, find a postbox, and send his latest message into the world. Then, he would disappear into the shadows once more, leaving the authorities scrambling in the dark, chasing ghosts. As he prepared to leave the cabin, he took one last look around. The place was just as he had found it, no sign of his presence left behind. He stepped outside, the cool night air wrapping around him like a shroud. The sky was clear, the stars twinkling coldly above, indifferent to the horrors that had just unfolded below. The Zodiac killer climbed into his car and started the engine. He drove slowly down the dirt road, the trees closing in behind him as he disappeared into the night. The fear he had unleashed at Lake Berryessa was just the beginning. He knew there would be more victims, more letters, more terror. And with every act, his legend would grow, casting a long, dark shadow over California. He drove toward the town, the headlights of his car piercing the darkness ahead. The road was empty, the world silent, as if holding its breath in anticipation of his next move. The Zodiac killer felt nothing but a cold, detached satisfaction, knowing that when the sun rose again, the world would wake to a new wave of fear, one that he had carefully, methodically orchestrated. And so, with a heart as cold as the night around him, he drove on into the unknown, leaving behind only death and the promise of more to come. October 11th, 1969, San Francisco, California. It was a typical Saturday night in San Francisco. The city, usually bustling with activity, was calm as it settled into the weekend. But for Paul Stein, a 29-year-old cab driver, this night would take a dark and deadly turn. Stein had picked up a fare in the theater district, a routine job in his line of work. The passenger requested to be taken to the intersection of Washington and Cherry Streets in the upscale Presidio Heights neighborhood. There was nothing unusual about the request. It was just another ride in a city full of them. But this was no ordinary fare. As Paul Stein reached the intersection of Washington and Cherry, his life was about to be brutally cut short. Without warning, the passenger pulled out a 9mm Luger pistol and fired a single shot into the back of Stein's head. The shot was precise, the work of a killer who knew exactly what he was doing. Paul Stein, a young man with his whole life ahead of him, was dead before he even knew what had happened. But the murder wasn't enough for this cold-blooded killer. He wanted a trophy, something to prove that he had been there, something that would taunt the police in the days to come. With chilling precision, the killer used a knife to cut away a large piece of Paul Stein's blood-soaked shirt. The killer knew what he was doing. He wiped down the cab, carefully erasing any trace of his presence. He left nothing behind, except for the body of Paul Stein and the growing terror in the hearts of San Francisco's residents. Minutes later, 3 teenagers living nearby noticed the scene from their window and immediately called the police. They reported seeing a white man, approximately 25 to 30 years old, casually walking away from the cab. It was a crucial piece of information, but by the time the police arrived, the killer was long gone. The police arrived to find a scene of horror, a murdered cab driver, a missing piece of his shirt, and a killer who had vanished into the night. The only clues were the eyewitness accounts and the chilling message that would soon follow. Just days later, the San Francisco Chronicle received another letter from the Zodiac, this time containing a piece of Paul Stine's bloodied shirt. It was the killer's way of proving that he was responsible, taunting the police with his audacity and daring them to catch him. The murder of Paul Stine sent shockwaves through San Francisco. The Zodiac's ability to strike without warning, to kill in cold blood, and then to vanish without a trace left the city paralyzed with fear. No one knew where or when he would strike next, and that uncertainty was his greatest weapon. November 1969, the San Francisco Chronicle received yet another letter from the Zodiac killer. By now, the sight of these letters had become an ominous ritual, each one bringing with it new horrors, new taunts, and new threats. But this letter was different. This one threatened to unleash a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. This is the Zodiac speaking. I have become very upset with the people of the San Fran Bay Area. They have not complied with my wishes for them to wear some nice Zodiac buttons. I promised to punish them if they did not comply. So I now have a little list, starting with the school children. I am now in control of this, and all of you will be my slaves if you don't play my game. But the letter's most chilling content was a detailed diagram of what the Zodiac called his death machine, a bomb he claimed to have built, designed to bring death and destruction to those he saw as his enemies. The diagram was disturbingly precise, each component labeled with the cold logic of a madman. The Zodiac claimed that this death machine was already constructed and ready to be used. His chosen target, a school bus filled with innocent children. He described how he would plant the bomb and wait for the bus to pass by before triggering the explosion, sending the bus and everyone inside it to a fiery end. The threat struck fear into the heart of the city. Parents were gripped with terror at the thought of sending their children to school, knowing that a madman had threatened to blow up a bus. The police, already stretched thin in their hunt for the Zodiac, now had to contend with the possibility of a mass casualty event. The city was on edge, the fear palpable in every classroom, every home, every street. The police took the threat seriously. Bomb squads were put on high alert, and every available officer was tasked with protecting school buses. The diagram, though simple in its design, was disturbingly plausible. The Zodiac's words weren't just a threat. They were a promise, one that the city feared he might keep. As the days passed, the Zodiac's threat hung over the city like a dark cloud. The killer had shown time and again that he was willing to follow through on his promises, and now he had the entire city in his grip. The fear was his weapon, and he wielded it with terrifying precision. But the bomb never detonated. No school bus was blown up, and no children were harmed. The Zodiac had once again played his twisted game, using fear as his tool, keeping the city on edge, always wondering when and where he would strike next. The letter, like all the others, was carefully filed away, added to the growing collection of taunts and threats that the Zodiac had sent over the months. Each letter brought the police closer to understanding the mind of this killer, but it also deepened the mystery of who he was and why he killed. The Zodiac had once again demonstrated his ability to strike fear into the heart of San Francisco. He didn't need to detonate a bomb to cause chaos. His words were enough. And as the city tried to return to normal, the question lingered. When would the Zodiac strike again? From 1970 to 1974, the Zodiac sent numerous letters to the police department with taunts and threats. Some of them included clues as to his past murders, and one of them connected him to the Bates murder in 1966. The letters include a kill count at the bottom, and it gradually rises throughout the years, but none of the murders were connected to the Zodiac. At the bottom of each letter, the Zodiac included a kill count, a macabre tally of his supposed victims. The number started small, matching the murders he had publicly claimed. But as the letters continued, the number began to rise. 5, 7, 9. With each new letter, the count increased, as if the Zodiac was keeping score in a deadly game. But something was amiss. Despite the rising count, many of these murders were never connected to the Zodiac. There were no reports of bodies, no investigations linking the deaths to the killer. The Zodiac was either lying, inflating his numbers to sow more fear, or he was indeed committing murders that the police had yet to uncover. As the years passed, the Zodiac continued to send letters, each one filled with more taunts and cryptic clues. His kill count continued to rise, 12, 14, 17, but the bodies didn't always follow. Some murders were never linked to the Zodiac, leading the police to question whether these killings had even occurred. The Zodiac thrived on the chaos he created, keeping the police in a constant state of uncertainty. Were there more victims out there, undiscovered, or was the Zodiac inflating his numbers to terrorize a city that was already on edge? The lack of evidence left the police grasping at straws, never knowing if the next letter would bring news of another murder or another lie. By the time the Zodiac's letters stopped, his final claimed kill count stood at 37. But how many of those were real? How many were victims of the Zodiac's twisted mind, never found, never reported, never linked to the killer who had terrorized the Bay Area for so long? The Zodiac's letters remain one of the most chilling aspects of his crimes, a record of his twisted mind, a taunt to the authorities, and a puzzle that, to this day, remains unsolved. The true number of his victims may never be known, but the fear he instilled in a city and a nation will never be forgotten.